And that's the return of Nimrod, the original world dictator. You know, when we started this series, we took a look at the earliest empires from the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia. And of course, Daniel gives us a profile in advance of the empires from Babylon on. The Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon, becomes prominent in both the Old and New Testament passages. Babylon was conquered by the Persians, and the Persians were in turn conquered by the Greeks. And the Greek Empire actually breaks up under Alexander. You know, in Daniel chapter 11, we have the handover from the Persian Empire to the Greek Empire. The first couple of verses deals with those successors to Cyrus. You remember Cyrus? He conquered Babylon in Daniel 5. He had a letter written to him 150 years before he was born in Isaiah 45. He's succeeded by Cambyses, Artaxerxes, Darius, and then Xerxes I, who is the king that is prominent in the book of Esther. He's also the king that conducts a disastrous campaign against the Greeks and really provides the motivation for Alexander 150 years later to take over the Persians. Xerxes is followed by Artaxerxes Longimanus, and he's famous, of course, to us because he gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem that triggers the 70 weeks of Daniel. But that brings us to Alexander the Great, the close of the Persian Empire and the beginning of what we call the Greek Empire. But when Alexander dies, the empire gets divided among his four generals. Cassander takes Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus, Asia Minor and Thrace, and Syria and Babylon go to Seleucus, and Egypt, Arabia, and Israel go to Ptolemy. It's Seleucus and Ptolemy that become key to our investigation. And they are prominent in Daniel chapter 11, and they are key to understanding the prophecies having to do with the Antichrist. When the empire divided, of course, Cassander and Lysimachus take places that aren't prominent in our narrative. Seleucus takes the lion's share, Ptolemy, of course, Egypt. But the dynasties that succeed from these two leaders war for several centuries, Israel, of course, being caught between them as a buffer state. In Daniel chapter 11, from verse 5 through 35, we have written in advance the careers of the leaders in both of these series. The Ptolemies, from Ptolemy I right on through to Ptolemy VI, and from Seleucus all the way through to a climactic one called Antiochus Epiphanes. And what's so fascinating, I encourage you to really study these details in Daniel 11 with some good encyclopedias, and you'll be startled to realize that the careers of these leaders are written well in advance. They're so detailed, so clear, that cynics and skeptics have tried to late date Daniel. But fortunately, it is one of the best documented books in the Bible, and furthermore, it was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ's ministry. But the thing that's relevant to our inquiry here is that following Antiochus Epiphanes, who's clearly presented as a type of this final world leader, we continue to have, for the rest of the chapter, the next 10 verses, detailed prophecies about the Antichrist that are expressed in terms as a successor, as a king of the north. Now, as we stand back from all of this, we realize that history consists of 7 super kingdoms of Satan. In Revelation 12:3, it says, "There appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads." And of course, as we look at the parade of empires, we realize that there are 7 of them: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then Rome in a second phase. These last empires, which I'll call Daniel's 4+1, are of course familiar to us because when Daniel wrote during the Babylonian captivity, he detailed Nebuchadnezzar's dream and also a series of visions that he had and lays out that history in advance. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then Rome in 2 phases. So there's really 4 empires, but the last one comes in 2 phases. And I think most scholars recognize that Rome, and what I'll call Rome II, or Rome Revisited, is really expressed in the same idioms in Daniel's prophecies, in Daniel 2 and 7 and so on. And this is also picked up in Revelation 13, 17, and so on. Now, there is a verse in Revelation 17 that constantly puzzles us. I've studied this for many decades. I've searched all the commentators, and none of them really make clear what the 10th verse of Revelation 17 says. John tells us, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Well, when you stand back from these empires, it's pretty clear. The 5 that are fallen, when John is writing, of course, is Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, because he's writing during the Roman period. He says 1 is, and that of course, is Rome itself. And the other is not yet come. And that, of course, is Rome 2, as I'll call it here, characterized by these famous 10 horns, which of course are detailed in Daniel 2 and 7, Revelation 13 and 17, and so on. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. All well and good, but the next verse in chapter 17 is puzzling. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, but he is of the 7 and goeth into perdition. Well, which of these, obviously this is referring to what I'll call the 11th horn. We all know about the 10 horns, but there's a little horn in Daniel 7, Daniel 8 that comes up and takes over. So the 11th horn is a reasonable title for this coming world leader. But this is the one that was and is not. Now he's the 8th. Clearly he's the 8th in the sense of these leaderships here. And yet he is of the 7, which means in some sense he is from this list of 7. But he was that which was and is not. Which of these 7 existed but doesn't exist today? Well, clearly, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, and Rome all have vestiges present in our horizon. There's one that's mysteriously absent from archaeological history as well as secular history, and that's namely Assyria. I'd like to explore this a little further because I think it's been overlooked. You notice when the rise of Rome occurs, they conquered Greece in 146 BC, Lysimachus' kingdom in 133 BC, then Seleucus' kingdom in 64 BC, and finally Egypt in 31 BC, Ptolemy's kingdom. So little by little, Rome absorbs what previously was Alexander's empire. They all disappear, in effect, before the birth of Christ, but all of us fall into the trap when we think of the Roman Empire of confining our horizon to the western leg of it. The eastern leg of the Roman Empire endured for 1,000 years more after the western leg fell. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but that's our label. It's really the vestige of the Roman Empire. And it consists of nations that we often don't think of as Roman, especially Seleucus' kingdom. Now, it's interesting, in recent history, each of these elements have reemerged. In 1906, Iran reemerges. In 1921, Afghanistan gets their independence. In 1922, Egypt and Iraq. 24, Turkey, and Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and finally, of course, Pakistan and Israel. Now, it's interesting. Egypt, of course, was Ptolemy's turf in those days, way back. The rest of these, with the exception of Iran, the rest of these are Seleucus. Actually, Turkey is Seleucus and Lysimachus together. But notice that all the elements of Seleucus and Ptolemy have resurfaced in our modern history. And it's interesting that 2 of these, Iraq and Syria, constitute what used to be called, prior to the Babylonian Empire, Assyria. Very, very unique, distinctive culture, and about which the Bible has much to say. In fact, it's interesting to realize that in Isaiah 10 and Micah 5, what the person we call the Antichrist is called the Assyrian. I think we need to really focus on this guy. When we get to Micah, there's an interesting passage. It says, this one shall be the peace, speaking, of course, of the Messiah. When the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we rise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. Could it be the 7 angels pouring out wrath? Could it be the Messiah coming? And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod, and the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian, when he cometh into our land, when he treadeth within our borders. Now, some people will say that this occurred in history, except you may recall when the Assyrians, while they did capture the northern part of the kingdom, when they tried to get Jerusalem, Sennacherib was confronted with an angel that slaughtered 185,000 of his troops that night, and he went back and never tried again. So they never did. Assyria did not enter Jerusalem and the area of Judah. So